Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying to change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing it?
Well, yeah, now that we've got that out of the way, let's get to the $1 million question. All right. The $1 million question of the day. Is it okay to marry outside one's race? Well, Dr. Umar doesn't seem to think so. What position should a Christian hold on this question? Well, we're going to tackle this from really both of those angles. Okay. Now take a second to, listen to what Dr. Umar has to say about interracial marriage.
So when we say Pan-African nationalism, or other brothers would say black nationalism, people assume they must be the reverse of the Ku Klux Klan. They must be the reverse of the white knights. Nothing could be further from the truth. I do not have to hate you in order to embrace myself. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the Breakfast Club interview, what's getting a lot of attention now is the fact that I said that I have a difficult time respecting black men who are not committed to black women.
I heard that.
And people say, well, how could you say that? I could say that because, number one, that's my position. See, within Pan-Africanism as Garveyites, we don't believe in interracial marriage. But we don't believe in interracial marriage not for the same reasons as a white nationalist. A white nationalist doesn't believe in interracial marriage because he thinks white people are better than black people, and that to mix with us is to downgrade their own genetics. But when we say that a black man shouldn't date a white woman, we're not saying it because we consider the white woman to be inferior. We're saying it because we love black women, i.e., only 1 out of every 4 black women in America get married. Black women are the last married and the first divorced. Right now, we got millions of black women with raising children on their own, single-parent households, no daddy. So for us, we say the black man should be with a black woman, not because we hate the white woman, but we know that if we're going to save our own community, it starts with the black man being committed to his own woman first.
Now, I want to represent Dr. Umar fairly here. So, let me say this, before we really get into it. Dr. Umar presents his view on interracial marriage framed a couple different ways. On the one hand, he says things like, any man who marries outside his race, doesn't commit to a black woman, doesn't get any respect from me. Okay. The key here, he says that from him, that person is not going to get respect. Now, Dr. Umar can choose to have respect or not have respect for whoever he wants or whatever he wants or doesn't want, that's his personal choice. Right. Where the problem comes in is when he says things like, Frederick Douglass made a mistake in marrying a white woman, late in life, or, just definitive statements like, the black man needs to be with a black woman only. I mean, he really goes in on it, in such a way that gives the impression that he believes what he's saying applies to all black men and women, not just himself. Now, we got our thinking caps on today, so I'm not coming from the standpoint of, what I don't like about, Dr. Umar's statement. For us, what I'm trying to do here is, really dig into why I believe that he's unreasonable. Okay. And I do believe he's unreasonable, in terms of his position. And I think we can demonstrate that fact. So first off, okay, we've got to bring the concept of worldviews back into focus here, because that's really what this all boils down to. Okay. Again, Dr. Umar is an avowed Pan-Africanist. Okay. Pan-Africanist to the bone. Now, just like I spoke about earlier, when you had with the analogy that I gave you about the boxer, how the boxer will set you up with a jab and then hit you with something heavy. And, we talked about how Dr. Umar does something similar where he uses unsupported assertions like that jab. He sets you up for the conclusion that he wants you to come away with. Now, we're going to see a similar pattern here in terms of how Dr. Umar applies his worldview to questions like whether interracial marriage is cool or not. Okay. But this time there's a slight twist, because if you understand the Pan-Africanist worldview and how everything for Dr. Umar comes down to is such and such good for black people or bad for black people, okay, then through that lens, his responses make a lot of sense. His view of interracial marriage is consistent, with his worldview, at least on the surface anyway. And I think when you combine that consistency, with him being passionate, as a speaker, then he comes off as very persuasive, very compelling. Okay. But as they say, the devil's in the details, and there are definitely some weak spots in Dr. Umar's armor. Okay. So just so we're on the same page, let me give you the broad direction of where I'm trying to go here. Okay. What I'm going to do is start by attacking the question, by looking at Umar's Pan-Africanism more closely. Okay. You see the worldview, I gave the house example earlier, about how, every worldview has foundations. Okay. And if you have those foundational ideas, if you can kind of show where there's some flaws there, then the worldview collapses. So that's kind of the approach that I'm going to, take there. There are assumptions that are foundational to Dr. Umar's, Pan-Africanism, and everything that he, thinks, the conclusions he comes to. I mean, they're built on that. So that's what we really want to target here. Okay. Now, remember, I also gave the example of, Jenga, how you pull the blocks out and the whole, thing falls. And so that's kind of what we want to do. You want to pull a few blocks from the bottom of Dr. Umar's worldview and then just kind of watch it unravel and, just see how that chops away at his case against interracial marriage. Okay. Secondly to that, we're going to deal with the specific reasons that he gives for condemning interracial marriage one at a time, and from there we will flow into how the Christian worldview provides a solid framework for thinking about race, and addressing the question of interracial marriage. All right. So after the Breakfast Club and Roland Martin interviews, Dr. Umar appears on another show. It's called We the Gods. I think it's a podcast or a radio show. And, the team of hosts, on the We the Gods is basically having a conversation, doing a recap of the issues at hand from the recent interviews and asking for clarity on certain points. Now, I want you to listen to what Dr. Umar says about the Pan-Africanism that he holds to. Okay. Now, again, there's different types of Pan-Africanism. I'm not lumping in Pan-Africanism altogether, but since we're doing a critique of Dr. Umar's specific views, this interview actually gives some interesting clarity on some of the things that he holds to. So let's take a listen to that, and then we'll get into it.
Number one is the Pan-African movement. A lot of people are not really clear, and it's generally a lot of people on the street who don't really know what that means or what that term is. And I see a lot of people use it loosely. That's exactly what that is.
Yes, sir. Pan-Africanism could be summarized briefly in 3 points. The first point is that all African people, all descendants of Africa, wherever they are in the world, irregardless of their religion, irregardless of their language, irregardless, of the culture that they practice, we are all members of the same African family. So whether you're in Nigeria speaking Yoruba, whether you're in Cuba speaking Spanish, whether you're in Brazil with Portuguese, whether you're in Chicago speaking Ebonics, we are one family, and we believe that we should identify with that family first before we identify with any other agency or organization. So we're never Christians who happen to be Africans, we're Africans who happen to be Christians. And the reason why the Africanity is primary is because it's the only organization we belong to that was chosen by God himself. Everything else you belong to, you chose. You chose your religion. You can leave it tomorrow. You chose to be a Mason. You chose to be a Greek. You chose to be a doctor. You chose to be a lawyer. Everything we belong to, we choose, but we don't choose our race. Thanks again. Appreciate y'all. And one last thing to my sister, ain't no such thing as biracial. If one of your parents is African, you African. Why? Because the European DNA is recessive. African DNA is dominant. When you mix chocolate milk and vanilla milk, you don't get half vanilla milk, you get chocolate milk. So you just as African as the rest of us, and I don't.
But I just don't like to not identify. My mother was the one who raised me. My mother was the one who taught the black girl to go to school. My mother was the one who made sure her morals were in line, and she did what she was supposed to. So I can't take that away from her.
You don't reject your mother. That's your mother. You never reject your mother. but you're an African with a white mother. There is no mix. There is no biracial, and never has been until recent time. This whole new identity matrix that they got black people fighting through, am I biracial? Am I multiracial? Am I non-racial? Am I part-racial? That's just a new strategy of divide and conquer, separate and rule, confuse black people with a whole bunch of new labels so they don't realize they black, so it becomes easier to isolate and dispose of us. If one of your parents are African, you are African, and that is nature's design.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Did you catch that? Okay. Now, as a Pan-Africanist, African identity is central to Dr. Umar's worldview. I mean, I feel like that kind of goes without saying. Now, all of the commitments and obligations that Dr. Umar puts out there for the black community in terms of, what people ought to be doing, this group we ought to be loyal to. This is how we ought to be loyal. Black men must not marry outside their race in order to, be loyal to the black struggle. All those, kind of obligations and directives flow from his Pan-Africanist worldview, and his Pan-Africanist worldview relies on his identity concept. Now, therefore, if we can find an unresolvable error, in his foundational, beliefs in regards to identity, this identity concept, then the worldview comes crashing down. Okay, you just you start to see some inconsistencies. Now, in what way is African identity central to Dr. Umar's Pan-Africanism, and why? Well, I mean, he tells us, right? Right in this last clip, Dr. Umar tells us that the reason Africanity is the basis of our identity and I guess kind of allegiance, is that Africanity is the only organization, according to Dr. Umar, it is the only organization that God chose for us. You didn't choose your race, he says, Now, my reply to that would be, well, guess what? You didn't choose your species either, right? It is not true that the only group that you belong to that God chose is the African group. Okay. You also belong to the human group, and you didn't choose that. You also didn't choose, like whether you would be a biological male or female. You didn't choose whether you would be tall and slender or, short and squatty. Well, now you may have had something to do with the squatty part, as I have, too much ice cream and too little exercise. But in terms of the overall body type, you understand what I mean. Now, there's a lot of things about you that we can, group people by, that you didn't choose. But Dr. Umar's reasoning for why Africanity ought to be the primary basis of identity and, allegiance or commitment is that Africanity is the only one. But he's wrong. All right. Now, if he says that Africanity is the only organization that one belongs to that we didn't choose, then all we need to do is to produce one example, okay, of another group that you and I belong to that's God-given and we didn't choose in order to falsify Dr. Umar's foundation for Pan-Africanism in that identity concept. And we have that, okay? We didn't choose our species. God made us human, right? We are part of a group of beings called human. And so we see when you really get down to it, Dr. Umar's whole worldview is built upon the foundation of a false theological assumption about who we are. Now, if all of his reasoning flows from a false belief about, God and identity, then we're already off to a bad start here. When you find a fatal flaw in somebody's worldview like that, then, all of a sudden you'll start to be able to pick up on the mental gymnastics that a person has to go through to make their worldview fit reality. Shout out to Nancy Pearcey on that. We're going to see those mental gymnastics as we move forward. But that's just so powerful. I mean, just really let that sink in. Dr. Umar's worldview is based upon his identity concept, okay? And his identity concept is based upon a false theological assumption. And so that house of cards of Umar's Pan-Africanism just starts falling down. Now, let's look at an example of that right quick in terms of how, you start to see this mental gymnastics come in. Okay. Now, Dr. Umar prioritizes Africanity above humanity. Okay. And he does so based upon that false theological assumption about identity. But notice how humanity just really cries out against that. Okay. In the interview, with DJ Envy, DJ Envy responds to Umar's condemnation of interracial marriage. He says, I don't agree with that. Who am I to tell my son who he should connect with? Or, you love who you love. You find interest in who you're around. They're nice to you and you like them. Something develops. I mean, that's how it works. Right. As a matter of fact, just go ahead and listen to this We the Guys interview. I'm going to give you a section of that just real quick. And you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Just that humanity crying out against, what Dr. Umar is saying. So, couple questions. Don't you think society possibly just portrays that? I mean, because the idea of even in our culture today, we can just go from the weaves, generally speaking, hair doesn't come out silky straight, and yet we're going to go put weaves in our hair to look a certain way, to identify with a different race that's not ours. No, we don't go to a salon and say, hey, I want the Afro puff weave. So what is it that we get away from Black women, but why? I mean, being mixed descent, I identify as a mixed girl, and I understand the issues that can come, sometimes not understanding backgrounds or not having the same background, but what is it about just loving a person versus loving a color, a creed, a religion? Why are we so stuck on the separation versus just the love aspect? Now, see how, Dr. Umar wants to reduce love to a socio-political chess move. Okay. But his questioner here draws attention to the fact that love transcends that sort of thing. Okay. One of Umar's mistakes is, I think he kind of blurs the lines between the effects or the implications of love versus love itself. Okay. In other words, love is more organic than, what Dr. Umar wants to make it out to be. Okay. Love and marriage may have political effects or implications, but that doesn't mean that we can box it in as, a political decision, full stop. Right. Our humanity just cries out against that kind of thing. Okay. I just find it interesting, that in the We the Guys interview, okay, Dr. Umar rightly observed that early on here in the West, Africans were fighting for or just to uphold the truth, that they were human, human persons, okay? But after having won that battle, Dr. Umar would have us lay aside the humanity that our ancestors fought for, okay? He wants us to relinquish that humanity and adopt his political pawn version of love and marriage. Well, honestly, man, he can keep that. I'm not really interested. I can't really ride with him on that one, But so anyway, so we've got a false theological assumption here, but let's add on another layer to it. Okay, what does it mean to be African? Let's consider what Dr. Umar has to say about it. And what genetics have to say about it. Okay, now we're referring back to this clip here that he, where he was talking about the first principle of Pan-Africanism, the first point that he made about Pan-Africanism. Now, he said a couple things. Now, just kind of, listen to this. He said that the child of a mixed race marriage is an African. Okay, Africans are Africans no matter where they live, what language they speak, culture they practice, or religion they follow. Regardless of any of that, according to Dr. Umar, Africans are Africans. Okay. Dr. Umar also says that in the Breakfast Club interview, Dr. Umar also says that Africans were the first to settle everywhere, every area on the planet. He gives an example. He speaks of a group called the Grimaldis, who were supposedly Africans that settled Europe and then lost their pigmentation over time. So, the Europeans descended from this group of Africans called Grimaldis. Now, as far as genetics is concerned, loosely speaking, we do have some agreement between Umar and, leading theories of genetics right now. Now, science is always provisional, but, based on the evidence, it is certainly a mainstream position to hold, to say that genetically all human beings trace back to Africa. Okay. So what does all that mean when you put it all together to get together? Okay. According to Dr. Umar's own definition of who is African, along with the evidence that we have through the study of genetics, all human beings are Africans. according to how he defines Africans and, the genetic evidence. I mean, really think about it. Okay. Genetically, we all come from Africa. According to Umar, Europeans are descendants of Grimaldi Africans who lost their pigmentation later on. Plus, if Africans were the first to settle everywhere and the child of a mixed race relationship is an African, then whatever children these ancient Africans settling the planet had were Africans. And therefore, their children after that were Africans. And their children's children, and then children's children's children. I mean, all the way down to our present day. Okay, so according to Umar, we are all Africans. All right. Now, mind you, again, Dr. Umar made it clear that things like current geographical location, religion, language, and cultural practices don't take away from someone's Africanity. So a white English-speaking Christian who descended from the Grimaldi Africans and who settled Europe, however many years ago, would qualify on Dr. Umar's definition as an African. Yeah, it's very interesting. Now, listen, if by Dr. Umar's own reasoning, we are all Africans, then that means that when a black man marries a white woman, Dr. Umar has nothing to object to because we're all Africans. Interracial marriage doesn't exist, right? The only possible marriage that there could ever be is an African being married to another African. I mean, honestly, man, this is not just semantics, folks. I mean, this is what happens when you take what people say to its logical conclusions and then watch it fall apart under the weight of its own illogical basis. Now, if Dr. Umar is going to maintain his beef against interracial marriage, he's going to have to smuggle in additions to his definition of Africa in order to do so. And in fact, I think that's what exactly what he does, as we'll see here in a minute. Now, already we see Dr. Umar's position on interracial marriage is just, full of problems and just inconsistency. But let's take it further, to look at some of his specific reasons for opposing interracial marriage. Okay. Now, we're dialoguing with, DJ Envy on the Breakfast Club. Dr. Umar says, who you marry tells me who you are. He kind of goes on this thing that, as a black man, if you're marrying a white woman, you're not just marrying the white woman, you're marrying, her family, her culture, her people, and, so on and so forth. And now this is where his worldview really starts, just the inconsistency starts creeping in. Because according to his definition of African and how the world was settled, I mean, we're all Africans, right? We just talked about that. So to marry a white woman, her people are Africans. Of a different sort, of course, but they're Africans. So there's no crossing over of people groups going on here, right? Not according to Dr. Umar's view. I mean, plus, Dr. Umar did say that cultural differences doesn't make someone not an African, so he shouldn't have a problem with a black man marrying his white European descendant of Grimaldi African sister, right? I mean, or maybe cousin or something like that. Aside from that the same thing goes both ways. I mean, if a black man is marrying a white woman and that tells you something about him, then what does that tell you about the white woman marrying a black man? What does that tell you about her? I mean, because, she's marrying his family, culture, and people, and so on. So, I mean, I'm fairly certain that Dr. Umar wouldn't, I'm sure he would find a way to diagnose her with some pathological reason for marrying a black man in order to maintain his worldview. But it seems just silly to me. It just seems so silly and just such a cookie cutter way just to give everybody marrying outside their race, this mental health issue, that we'll talk about in a minute, rather than just saying, maybe they just married each other because they love each other. How about that? Right. But anyway, so aside from that, Dr. Umar also brings up loyalty. He says that young men must be taught loyalty to their community. And the greatest sign of loyalty is to marry a black woman who shares the same struggle. Now, one could ask, who gets to decide, for everybody else, what the greatest sign of loyalty to one's community is? Like where in the Pan-African Bible, Book of Umar, chapter what, verse what, does it say that just as a matter of universal obligation, the highest loyalty as a black man is to marry a black woman. I mean, dog, like, who are you to determine that, right? I mean, and then, just how is it that you just get to use your opinion on loyalty to judge other people's marriages? I mean, that's just whack, man. Later for that, But anyway, people have various paths to choose from to contribute to the cause. And if, the weight of your argument, for what you believe loyalty is just shaming people with your own personal opinion of what loyalty is supposed to look like, then that's a bunch of bullcrap. That's not an argument. That's just you shaming people based on your subjective opinions, So you just keep that to yourself, bro. But anyway, next point, Dr. Umar goes on to make, one of his major points in defending defending his views on interracial marriage. He says that, a black man should only be with a black woman because only the black woman can understand the black man's struggle. Okay, you need somebody that can feel you, and only the black woman can do that for a black man. Now, it's interesting, that based on, a quote that I obtained from Frederick Douglass, it seems that his famous ancestor disagrees with Umar on this point. But, we'll get back to that later, okay? Now, I'd like to make 2 points here. The first one is somewhat technical, and the second one is kind of more so common sense. Just kind of bear with me here. First of all, when Dr. Umar speaks of, a white woman not being able to understand a black man's struggle, he's making an epistemological claim, okay? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with how we know things, okay? What does it mean to say that you know this or that? Like, what is knowing? Okay, there's a whole branch of philosophy about that. Now, I'm not going to go too deep here. My boy Leroy Hill, wrote an excellent article, on this point, which I attached to this podcast. So you should be able to click on it and check it out, which I would definitely encourage you to do. I'll be touching on some highlights, but it definitely would be worth your while to check that out. Now, what I want to look here is that, broadly speaking, there are three forms of knowledge, okay? We can know things by what's called propositional knowledge, okay? That's just, facts of the matter, kind of knowledge. Like Donald Trump is the president, 2 + 2 = 4, that sort of thing. Just kind of, assertions, that's propositional knowledge. Okay. Now, then you have what's kind of direct awareness or experience. We kind of know what that is. We can throw the word intuition in there. And then, we have the skill building, kind of knowledge, like, knowing something in the same way that you know how to ride a bike, or Steph Curry knows how to shoot 3-pointers, kind of like it's a skill that one has developed, and you know how to do this or that by having developed a skill. Those are the three ways in which people can know things. The three forms of knowledge, broadly speaking. Okay. Now, when Dr. Umar says that a white woman can't understand a black man, like, what does he mean by that? Like, surely he doesn't mean that she can't understand his struggle from a propositional standpoint. I mean, white people can certainly understand, the black struggle in terms of, propositional knowledge. And, later on, the lady on Roland's panel picks up on this point and points that out to Dr. Umar, which is, why she points out, white folks like, Tim Wise, who are very vocal about the black struggle. And, I would throw in Dr. Edward Baptist, name there as well. He's another scholar, historian, who's Caucasian. And, he clearly understands, the wrongdoings of America's past. He understands that racism exists, and he gets the dynamics of it. Okay. So I think when Dr. Umar says that white people can't understand a black man's struggle, he can't be referring to propositional knowledge, just facts of the matter. He must be talking about something more along the lines of experience, that sort of knowledge, that second type, maybe even the third, in terms of, being able to, have you experienced racism? Have you had to endure it and, learn maybe coping skills or how to, handle it and that kind of a thing? I think that's kind of more so where Dr. Umar is coming from. Now, the problem here is this, when you say folks can't know this or that, you're misunderstanding how experiential knowledge works. Okay. Human experience is as diverse as there are, people on this planet. Even if there are shared or similar experiences, that's not going to produce a uniformity of what individuals perceived or know about those shared experiences. Okay. You could have 3 people in a room, set the thermostat to 70 degrees, let them sit there for 30 minutes. And after that, ask them if they were, comfortable, with the room temperature. Now one might say it's too hot. The other would say it's too cold. The third might say it's all right, just right. I mean, maybe one has stood outside in the heat, for a while before coming into the room. And so the room felt comfortable to them. While the other person may have been sitting in a cold office all day. So the room might have felt cold to that person, same room, different perspectives. Partly because what each person brings to the experience has something to do with what they perceive, feel, or believe about that experience. To make it more real, in the Old South, you had some plantations where some slaves tried to escape and some believed that they were incapable of doing so. Now, surely they all had some similar experiences, but again, they held different perspectives, right? So your experience is your experience, and my experience is my experience. It's not just, having similar experiences doesn't guarantee that there's like this universal or uniform knowledge. At the end of the day, what helps us to bridge the gap in understanding is what I would say commonality and communication. Okay. Now, we might not all experience the same thing, but there are common threads in the human experience. Okay. For example, like a white person may not know what it's like to be followed around a store as if you were going to steal something simply because you're black. But they can understand what it's like to be disrespected or treated unfairly. People of all colors know what unfairness looks like, right? So by tapping into the human experience, a white person can gain some understanding of the black experience. Now, obviously, it's not going to be in the sense of experiential knowledge, but think of it this way. Anybody who disagrees with me on that point, you have to explain why I, being a 37-year-old man, never lived through the civil rights era, knows who Bull Connor is. Now, Bull Connor was a racist sheriff down south who, ordered those under him to abuse black protesters, beat them with billy clubs, firemen's water hoses turned against him, and all that, right? Now, I know who he is because MLK employed the use of television and newspapers to publicize the brutality of Southern racism. Now, his strategy was to show people what was going to just something that would provoke the compassion of white people in America and in Europe who were on the sidelines, and kind of just, playing the fence. He wanted to provoke them to action, for, obviously the support of the civil rights movement. Now I'm not sure it's possible to even quantify the effectiveness of Martin Luther King's strategy there, but we do see white folks in those old pictures marching arm in arm with Martin Luther King. Now, some such, white folks, I'm thinking about the freedom riders here, were killed, for being, nigger lovers, so-called, right? Now, I find it hard to believe that, these white folks voluntarily died for a cause that they couldn't understand. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, So, anyway, when you think about it, I think it's empathy, is what we're talking about here. Okay. Some people have it and other people maybe not so much. Now, if you're attempting to marry a person that is incapable of having empathy, then quite frankly, you have a bigger problem on your hands than color for starters. If you do find yourself ready to marry someone or are already married to someone who does have the ability to show empathy, then it is incumbent upon you to communicate your feelings and experiences to that person in such a way that they can connect with you on the matters that are important to you. Speaking of importance, I think that leads to another kind of commonsensical point, right? People who enter into marriage, we enter into marriage with all sorts of needs, traumas, pain, and so on. We all got baggage, right? Nobody's perfect, okay? Struggles related to race aren't the only kind of struggle out there. Okay. People are very complex, and we really can't just reduce black folks down to one aspect of their experience. Okay. In some sense or another, it's probably true that all black folks deal with race some sort of way, but what if that's not a big deal to me though? As far as where I need support in my life, right? I mean, like who is Umar Johnson to declare that all of our marital needs are the same in that regard. Okay. Now, as a clinician, I've worked with youth that have been physically or sexually abused. some neglected, and just all sorts of trauma that are not race related, and yet occupy a prominent place in how they function and are developing through life. Now, it may be that they need more support in that kind of area than something that has to do with race, right? Now, it seems to me that we ought to allow for people to engage in relationships that suit them, right? I mean, suits them and suits their needs as they see it, rather than people like Umar imposing his own race-centered perspective on other people's relationships. This argument from Umar is just a bad argument, man, because in all relationships, neither party has had all of the same experiences as the other, right? I remember my wife asked me one time if I would endure labor for her, if I could, instead of her having to deliver our first child. And I was like, heck nah. Nah, man. I ain't about that life. I was born a man, and I thank God for it, I was like, heck no, man. I was joking, of course. Halfway joking. But my point is, I'll never know what it's like to be a woman, okay? To experience childbirth. I'm a dad, and I see things through dad lens. I don't know what it's like, raising kids from a mom's perspective and having to put my career on hold, or not having anybody to talk to around the house all day except for, 2 toddlers and a newborn, right? There are some legitimate challenges, there that I'll never have experiential knowledge of. But I can empathize with her, okay? I can connect with her as she communicates with me and be a support to her as best I can. That's what mature people do in marriage, okay? They work together to embrace and or overcome their differences as they grow and experience life together. That's what, marriage is all about, right? Now, aside from whether or not a white person can understand the black struggle, Dr. Umar attributes the increase of black folks marrying non-Africans to what basically amounts to a mental health problem. For the most part, he focuses on black men here, marrying outside their race, marrying white women, whatever. He goes on a short rant about black men seeking white validation and therefore seeking the white man's prize, referring to the white woman. Now, I'm not aware of any studies, that have been conducted by which we have evidence to make that blanket claim that a black man, as Dr. Umar says, cannot marry a white woman without there being some issue of inferiority to white males going on in the black man's mind. I guess Dr. Umar just expects us to take it by faith, that that's the case because he's a psychologist, I guess, Now, I'm sure there's some black person somewhere, that this applies to, right? But Dr. Umar doesn't give us a reason as to what justification he would have in diagnosing an entire group of black males with this problem, right? Now, if we're trying to form a hypothesis about why black men are marrying outside their race so much, and all we had to go on, was statistics about black men marrying white women, then I suppose Dr. Umar's explanation would be, I guess, the best we have to work with. But in fact, there are other statistics that we can, take into account that I think give us a broader picture than, just the black only lens that Dr. Umar seems to view life through. Now, according to a Pew research conducted in 2013 and in 2015, it turns out that both Asians, Native Americans, and Hispanics are far more likely to marry someone outside their race than African Americans. So black males aren't the only ones, jumping across, the racial divide as they, jump the broom, right? And another interesting point, according to, a Pew study, interracial marriages account for about 18% of all marriages in metropolitan areas, as compared to 11% in non-metropolitan or rural areas. Okay. Now, this goes to the point that DJ Envy made in the Breakfast Club interview, that people tend to get emotionally or romantically involved with the people that they're around. Metropolitan areas are more densely populated, which means more interaction between people of different races, which apparently results in more interracial marriages. Now, as a last note, kind of on this point here, Findings from a Gallup poll in 2013 show that 87% of Americans approved of interracial marriage between black folks and white folks, as compared to just 4% that approved of it back in 1958. That's around the time of the Loving case that Dr. Umar mentions in the Breakfast Club interview. Comparable numbers were also found in the Pew Research study as well, and hopefully I'll be able to post links to the description of this podcast so you guys can review this for yourselves. I'm not just making it up. But my point here is that there's a bigger picture to interracial marriage than just like the fractured mental state of black men who want to be white, according to Dr. Umar. It's not to say I'm sure maybe somebody's out there like that, but it's just that. That perspective just doesn't account for all the data. Now, if we step back and look at the data, we see a larger trend towards the acceptance of interracial marriage that includes, but extends beyond the black and white dynamic, right? I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by this, though. At this stage in history, there really are no pure races, with the exception of maybe a tribe or two in East Africa. But, as for the rest of us, somewhere along the line, we're all mixed. Because down through the ages, people groups have migrated from place to place, sometimes finding themselves in the same location. And the next thing you know, people from those different populations start having babies together. That's what geneticists call admixture. Okay, it's natural. It's natural, and it's always happened that way. And it's happening now. Okay, what Dr. Umar sees as being a symptom of self-hate is more likely just people groups living in close proximity, moving the direction that human history has always moved. Different folks joining together, literally and genetically. Figure out what I mean there. So we're coming to the end of Dr. Umar's arguments against interracial marriage. Okay. I guess to be charitable here, he would probably construe them not as arguments against interracial marriage, but probably he would construe it as arguments for same-race marriage, I'm guessing. But given the passion with which he communicates his disdain for interracial marriage, I think it's fair to say that he's staunchly against it, Now, all Dr. Umar's reasons, I think, of all of them, I think this last one is probably the strongest, I really kind of grappled with this one to kind of how to, wrap my arms around it. He basically makes an appeal to having compassion for the situation that single black women find themselves in, and he couples that with a sense of urgency and, obligation that's associated with the survival of the black race. Now, listen to this clip where I think he just really lays it out, exactly what I was saying, and then we'll come back and critique it.
When you are a member of a particular racial or cultural group that is under attack, you have an obligation to protect that group. And now we're in our fourth and most dangerously critical fight, and that is a fight for survival. And when you want to destroy your people, it begins in the homes. So if you want to dismantle black people, you got to dismantle the black family. So if we know that we must have an obligation and a loyalty to ourselves to protect who we are. So listen, I should be able to marry who I want. I should be able to date who I want. Under normal circumstances, maybe that would be okay. But guess what? We're not under normal circumstances and have for 400 years. When your family is under attack, you don't try to ignore it.
And Dr. Umar basically argues that given the circumstances of oppression that are bearing down on the black community, and the fact that black women are left out in the cold, rather than walk to the altar, black men have an obligation to commit themselves in a marriage to a black woman. Okay, this is a very interesting point. Now, it hinges on compassion and taking into account our current conditions in the black community. Okay, now I think if we pull away some of the layers here, we'll see that this argument actually doesn't stand up to scrutiny either, right? Now, as we dive into it, I want you to listen to another clip of Dr. Umar. I try not to do these back to back, but I want you to listen to another clip from Dr. Umar from the We the God show, which was a follow-up to this Roland Martin episode. And now in this clip, it's just really interesting. Let's just take a listen to it, and then we'll talk about it.
I understand completely what you're saying. When I get up and I go to work in the morning, I see the women on the bus stops going to school, going to work. I see the brothers at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock hanging out on the corners during the day.
And why is that? Because they don't have a father to teach them to be responsible. And why don't they have a father? Because the fathers are in jail, pushed out the home, whatever the situation may be. It's all systematic.
Now, even though it's systematic, there has to be a point.
Let's go back. Let's go back. 60 years ago.
Okay.
Who was selling the drugs? Who was running the guns? Who was the gangbangers? Who was
60 years ago, it wasn't black people.
Jewish
it wasn't.
immigrants.
Right.
Jewish immigrants.
Okay.
Italian immigrants. And Irish immigrants. They were doing the same things in Chicago that black men are doing today.
Now,
what changed that? I'll tell you what changed.
Okay.
In 1940, the United States government upgraded Jews, Irish, and Italians to white status. Prior to 1940, they were not considered white. And as a result of giving them the white status in 1940, they gave the Irish the police departments in America's major cities. They gave the Italian the fire departments in America's major cities. And they gave the European Jews the civil service municipal jobs in most of America's major cities that they still control to this very day. In other words, gentlemen and sisters, they gave them an economic stimulus package. When are we going to give our economic stimulus package? All men commit crime when they're miseducated and economically castrated. The black man is not unique. It just appears to be so. In 1940, the United States government upgraded Jews, Irish, and Italians to white status. Prior to 1940, they were not considered white. And as a result of giving them the white status in 1940, they gave the Irish the police departments in America's major cities. They gave the Italian the fire departments in America's major cities. And they gave the European Jews the civil service municipal jobs in most of America's major cities that they still control to this very day. In other words, gentlemen and sisters, they gave them an economic stimulus package. When are we going to give our economic stimulus package? All men commit crime when they're miseducated and economically castrated. The black man is not unique. It just appears to be so because we're not putting this within a historical context.
I mean, and I understand the historical context, but I still got to ask the question. My man makes a decision to stick a gun in my face, even though now the guns are here, and I agree with you, all of that. But there has to be a point where we, okay, let's set this axis and let's turn it. But if you got individuals who won't even acknowledge it and turn it,
but you keep saying individuals. This is not an individual problem
or system.
This is systematic.
Okay.
And the problem with us as a people, we never solve problems because whenever there's a systematic issue, we want to take it to individual moral responsibility. It's bigger than that.
Okay.
Now, what this clip shows is a glaring moral contradiction on Dr. Umar's part. Now, notice when the brother is talking about holding individuals accountable for crime in the black community, Dr. Umar goes out of his way, to give explanation after explanation and reasons kind of offsetting the responsibilities of individuals. Dr. Umar actually gets, just real animated, as he halfway chastises the guy for skipping past systemic accountability and jumping to holding individuals morally accountable. However, when it comes to black men who this system has driven to marrying white women in self-hate, as Dr. Umar alleges, somehow Dr. Umar has no respect for him. Just inconsistency there. I mean, Frederick Douglass and common criminals get a pass to some extent or another, but not black men marrying white women. They get no respect for them. I mean, it's just moral inconsistency all day, right? But even for women, though, I mean, I question how much Dr. Umar really cares. I mean, for the most part, Dr. Umar gives black men a hard time, but I mean, he makes it clear that he believes that a black man and a black woman getting married, I mean, that's all he's going to ride with, right? But what about granting black women the dignity of choice? Well, Umar doesn't care about that, of course. I mean, if you're in an interracial marriage, I mean, the good doctor here, I mean, he's just not cool with it. I mean, like, what kind of mess is that, really? I mean, it seems to me if Dr. Umar can't give black women the dignity of choosing whether to marry someone of another race or not, then really Dr. Umar only cares about black women, or at least only respects black women, to the extent that they line up with his misguided opinions on who they should or shouldn't be marrying. I mean, that just sounds kind of whack to me. I mean, it really does, I mean, why be so dogmatic about it as if that were the only solution to the problem, right? I mean, maybe if we remove the stigma of black people marrying white people, these single black women might allow themselves to expand the realm of possibilities in finding a mate. You know, maybe they won't feel all this unnecessary pressure to stay single forever, you know, or marry someone that doesn't fit where they're trying to go in life just because that person is black, right? In the meantime, maybe we can get these men in order, you know, stepping up, you know, their game educationally, career-wise, so that they present a viable option, you know, for these black women. You know, if we do that, then we'll have more black-on-black marriage, you know, going on, and women who are single, you know, and maybe roll in circles where there are options from other races will be freed from the Umars of the world who are trying to shame them into being with Africans only, you know. Maybe those women could find themselves in healthy interracial relationships, right? If Dr. Umar really cares about these black women. I mean, after all, according to Umar, I mean, a child from an interracial marriage is African anyway, you know. So whether a woman, you know, marries a black man or not, you know, maybe she chooses to marry outside her race. I mean, either way, we're producing more Africans. You know, it's good for us to increase the African population, right? I mean, shoot, matter of fact, I mean, the same would go for black men. I mean, if we follow Umar's beliefs to, you know, their logical conclusions, whether a black man, you know, marries inside their race or outside the race, interracial marriage is a win-win for black people. You know, interracial marriage produces more Africans. And you know, aside from that, I mean, you know, Dr. Umar believes that the primary function of racism is white genetic survival. So interracial marriage undermines that too, right? You know, so on his view, shoot, man, Dr. Umar should love interracial marriage. He should be all for it. Well, I just, you know, seriously doubt that Dr. Umar would, you know, go for any of that. But he says that he cares about black women and cares about black people. So in light of the fact that black people are under attack, and according to him, at risk of being exterminated by white people under these circumstances and conditions, the black community needs all hands on deck, and thus black men need to be marrying black women. Point blank, period. That's where Dr. Umar is at. Now, does, you know, Dr. Umar have a point here? You know, does the current state of the black community and Africans abroad give place to some sort of obligation for black women to only marry black men? You know, obviously vice versa. Well, let's talk about it. All right. But before we do that, I want to put some pieces in place. Okay. In order to tackle this question, you know, we need to get some things straight about race itself. So, you know, just kind of bear with me here for a second. All right. I won't spend too much time on this, but just to ask the question, what is race? Okay. So much of the public discourse, current events, and history revolve around this idea of race. But what is it? What is it? Okay. In terms of how we have come to understand and apply this idea of race, you know, here in the West, and then also, I guess, you know, just really across the modern world, you know, we find the origin of this idea in 18th century Europe, you know, among biologists and anthropologists who took it upon themselves to categorize people groups, just like biologists do with other species. Unfortunately, the notion of ranking people groups rather than just classifying them was or became a central feature of the race categorization kind of theory at that time. This obviously led to disastrous results for people of African descent, among others, who found themselves chained up as slaves, partly because of this race theory and the system of greed and exploitation that it was used to justify. Now, fast forward to today, scientists know better. They know better now. I mean, just so much work has been done in the area of genetics, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous, you know, mapping the genome and all that. I've included a couple of brief TED Talks that go into this further. But the bottom line is race, as we commonly apply the concept, has no foundation as a biological fact whatsoever. I mean, if you were to, you know, read someone's genetic code from start to finish, right? There's no part of that code that you come to and it's like, okay, this segment of the genetic sequence right here means that this person belongs to this race group or that race group. Okay. Genetics just doesn't provide us with markers like that, that we just have to follow in separating people, one from another. There are no distinct races. I mean, really get this, okay? Race is not a fact of biology. Race is a social construct that we human beings made up. Some guys in lab coats decided that we would all be separated by so-called races, and so society went along with it. Race is not a fact of biology. Race is a belief. And racism, in whatever way we might want to construe what that means, I mean, ultimately boils down to negative attitudes, perceptions, behaviors, and systems that work against people, of a certain group who have been classified based upon a belief and not a tangible fact of their biological makeup, as we have been conditioned to think. Race is a belief. It occurred to me, it's kind of interesting. It occurred to me while I was kind of working on this. I have to think about it, but I believe it's correct. It seems to me that when you really think about it, racism is more objectively real than race itself. It's kind of chewing on that. Now, Dr. Umar bases one of his arguments against interracial marriage on the conditions Black people are enduring. But these conditions he's alluding to all stem from racism, according to him. And racism is grounded in our beliefs concerning race classification. Now, given America's history and current problems, it seems to me that interracial marriage flies in the face of the beliefs about race that have fueled the racial oppression in this country. Interracial marriage basically gives a middle finger to the racist legacy that looms over our nation's past and present. And in that sense, far from being problematic or being a hindrance to the struggle, interracial marriage is a direct assault on the very ideological foundation that undergirds the conditions of racial oppression that Dr. Umar spends his life supposedly fighting against. Interracial marriage is a dagger in the heart of racism and the oppressive conditions that flow from it. Interracial marriage isn't part of the problem, y'all. It's part of the solution. But this is where that pesky worldview of Dr. Umar creeps up on us again, because in that he defines who he is based upon a false theological assumption that puts Africanity before humanity, his worldview just isn't big enough, to embrace interracial marriages as an assault on racism. Though logically speaking, we can affirm that. So we'll have to part ways with Umar for a second as we discuss this further. We'll have to go a few places that his worldview just can't take us. He just can't hang, man. Let's talk about the Christian worldview for a bit and see how it fits in here. Now, I will say that if the entirety of human experience revolved around the Black versus white or African versus non-African dynamic, then Dr. Umar's worldview might offer a sufficient explanation for the way things are. After all, no reasonable person would say that racism hasn't been a central feature of American history and brought about just an enormous amount of hatred, pain, suffering, and oppression. But I think far too often, the vast majority of us are content to just camp out there, camp out at evaluating the world based upon our more immediate American or Western context, rather than surveying the much wider landscape of human history and developing a more accurate or robust understanding of what we're seeing. There's no doubt that people have hated and subjugated people over here. But then when I look around, I start seeing these same evil behaviors and sentiments that I observe between whites and Black people popping up among other people groups. I mean, just, look at what Dr. Umar experienced in China. I mean, he says that the primary function of racism is white genetic survival, but that doesn't help us to make sense of why we see the same type of hate, mistreatment, and oppression in China, where there aren't hardly any white people around to benefit from it, right? Nor can we take Dr. Umar's understanding of racism and apply it to why Oliver Cromwell of England back in the day oppressed and enslaved the Irish for a period of time, or why Africans sold other Africans into European enslavement, as Europeans were latecomers to the African slavery market that had been in place long before the Europeans showed up. Or what about the brutally dehumanizing caste system of India, which I've heard has, gotten a little bit better, whatever that means. I don't know. What happened in Rwanda? Tribalism was responsible for, the mass genocide and ethnic cleansing that occurred there. Just to truly understand the evil that is committed by man, you have to look beyond just a particular segment of mankind. You have to look at the whole picture of mankind's history to understand what's going on. Now, from a Christian perspective, the problem is sin. Now, I can almost feel some of my listeners cringe, as they sense me, about to bring the Bible into the picture, but I bring the biblical narrative into this because I take Jesus seriously. As Christians, we have solid evidence to affirm that Christianity is indeed true, including historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, on that basis, we have good reason to take what Jesus said seriously. And Jesus affirmed the Old Testament scriptures. Christianity is, not just simply a set of ideas that one just accepts and lives happily ever after. Christianity is a real account of the real world. That is to say, it aligns with reality and gives us a picture of where mankind has been, is going, and everything important in between. My informed listeners will detect a little Greg Kokel in that last sentence. So anyway, God made man in his image and likeness. Among other things, he endowed mankind with free will. Mankind messed it up and sinned, rebelled against God. And man, along with all creation, has been dealing with the negative effects of rebelling against God ever since. Now, one of the symptoms of mankind's fallen state due to sin is a disruption in the social order that God intended for man. I mean, think about it. One of the first expressions of that sin nature that we see in Scripture is separation. I mean, sort of a precursor to the us versus them mentality. What you have is when God confronts Adam for disobeying the, eating the fruit or whatever. The first thing that comes out of Adam's mouth is, "It was that woman that you gave me." I mean, he's talking about the first married couple on earth, right? I mean, they've been riding together, and Adam, not even trying to call her by her name for real. Now all of a sudden she's that woman, right? And on top of that, he puts the blame on God as well. So Adam is like, "Yo, I got to look out for number one right now. Eve, you got to take that L." See, division crept in, right there already. A social order, that was based on, fellowship and communion, which God intended was just, lost with sin, right? Totally disrupted, right? This disruption is a feature of human history from then till now. It has taken on many shapes, but its prominent form, at least in our current context, is what we call racism. Racism is the present day manifestation of something that has, just raged against God's intent for mankind since the beginning. I mean, whether it be chattel slavery in America, Auschwitz, slavery among the West Africans before the transatlantic slave trade, the modern day sex trafficking, the murder of Tamir Rice, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the murder of Trayvon Martin, ethnic cleansing in Rwanda or Sudan, America's strange fruit. It's all the same problem, just dressed up in different clothes. Truly, there's just nothing new under the sun. It just looks new to us. But how did God intend for us to be? Okay, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 says, "Let us make man in our image and in our likeness." Now, volumes have been written on that verse. We could go a lot of different directions as to what it means to be made in the image of God and in the likeness of the creator of the universe. But for now, I just want to drive home this one particular aspect, okay, where this takes us in terms of our identity, okay? Dr. Umar would have us to take on Africanity as a starting point, since he believes that's the only people group that God chose for us. But the Christian worldview gives us more than that. We see in Genesis 1:26 that the reality is identity is not grounded in a feature of who we are. or even a feature of our earthly experience. As a matter of fact, the basis of our identity isn't grounded in us at all. And if we want to discover it, we'll have to look beyond ourselves. The foundation of who we are is not found in a pigmentation or a place, but rather in a person. Well, three persons actually, constituting one divine being. God himself is the basis of who we are. That's what puts the ID in Tru-ID. We are made in God's image, the Imago Dei. And we have been endowed with a purpose to reflect God's image and eternal will in the earth. See, we're talking about teleology now. Teleology, understanding the reason for which something exists. Purpose, all right? Not only is our identity rooted in a divine person, but it is also intertwined with a divine purpose. Now, as I mentioned, mankind uses free will to, buck on God. We call that sin. And that goes against who we were made to be. Reflections of God who are in communion with God. Sin stains us, so to speak. All right. The centerpiece of Christianity is how God became man, gave his life for man to rid us of that stain, restore communion between man and God, and really repair the damage that was done to all creation. One way or another, God is reconciling all things to himself through the work of Jesus Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, as it relates to us, God does that through the new covenant, which allows for us to be restored to him as his children. Okay. This also is an essential aspect of who we are. By being made alive again, God restores us back to who we were made to be. As it says in 2 Corinthians 5:17, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. God created man in his image and likeness. And through the new covenant that hinges on the cross of Christ, we are made a new creation in and through Christ. So these two creations of man are like two pillars of identity, whether we acknowledge it or not. The centerpiece of man's identity traces back to who God is and what God has done. In the Imago Dei, we have a point of common ground with all mankind, while the new covenant in Christ is in a sense a renewal of the Imago Dei and calls us to something higher than man-centered understandings of who we are. It's like the Imago Dei 2.0 in a sense in the new covenant. See, that's why Paul instructs believers in Galatians 3:28. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free. There's no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, he reiterates and kind of broadens this in Colossians 3:11 when Paul says, here there is not Jew and Greek, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. Now, these verses have often been used, in church anyway, to, I think, promote like this color blindness idea, as if these verses are a negation of ethnicity or cultural groups. But I think that's just a misreading of the text. I mean, these two verses don't negate or cancel out ethnicity. I mean, to read it like that, would be to say that gender is now canceled out. And I don't think that, Paul had gender neutrality in mind when he wrote those scriptures. These are about getting rid of the baggage in broader society by which people were devaluing and mistreating others, one another. They appeal to brotherhood in Christ to be a personhood equalizer. Now, in that sense, it would destroy the slave to slave owner relationship, since a restoration of the Imago Dei, equality of personhood, and God's intention of undisrupted social order are contrary to the institution of slavery just on a fundamental level, which appears to be at the heart of Paul's appeal in the book of Philemon. God doesn't have a problem with diversity. That's what I'm trying to get across here, right? He really doesn't. It's his idea. It's what we do with that diversity that becomes problematic. And by diversity, I mean diversity within oneself and diversity in relation to others. Okay. What do I mean by that? When I look in the mirror, I see the Imago Dei. I see a child of God, a husband, a father, a son, a person of African descent, American citizen, a social worker, employee, a video gamer, and a number of other things, right? We are all very complex, which is why, when we reduce everything to black versus white, we just inevitably miss out on a host of other things that really matter. I think the key to making sense of it goes back to that teleology, that I used that word earlier, that purpose. Okay. It seems to me that if you treat your identity as if it's divorced from your teleology or purpose, then you just won't know what to do with it. You won't know what to do with who you are. Right. But the Imago Dei and who we are in Christ kind of acts as an anchor for the other aspects of our identity. Now, all aspects of my identity, or at least, many aspects of it are important, and some of them God ordained, i.e., fatherhood, ethnicity as well, I would say. But while they are important, they aren't all equally important. Now, if you gave me an ultimatum to no longer be a social worker or to no longer be a father, I'm going to let my career go. No question about it. You know what I'm saying? Though, me being a father and being a social worker, those aren't equally important facets of my identity. These different parts of me, they have different roles in my life. Just like in a marriage, you have one union. Both the husband and the wife are different, obviously. And God has instituted a hierarchy of roles. But from a God's eye view, that doesn't mean that, one is more valuable than the other. In the case of marriage, you have different roles, but men and women are equally valuable. From scripture, we can see that some aspects of who we are hold more weight than others, right? For example, so let's look at how Paul rebuked Peter. Okay. Peter, he turned away his Gentile brothers in kind of like a secretive way because some Jewish brothers were coming by, and Peter didn't want the Jews, I guess they were Christians, but, Christian Jews, to think less of him for having Gentiles, hanging around. Now, Paul doesn't just say, that's messed up. He says something more profound than that. He says Peter's actions were contrary to the gospel. Okay. To import these ideas of ethnic hierarchy into the dynamic between him and brothers in Christ was contrary to the gospel. Through God's new covenant, who we are in Christ is an equalizer that is inherent in the gospel, but Peter wasn't abiding by that. He should have treated the Gentile believers in accordance with that Imago Dei as re-expressed in the gospel, rather than perpetuate the devaluation of them on the basis of ethnic differences and hierarchy. And also we might say, shame on Peter's Jewish visitors. For being the kind of people, that Peter felt like he had to hide his Gentile brothers in Christ from. There's just a whole lot going on there, believers today who would shy away from other believers on the basis of color. Jesus said that in the world, they fight for positions or power to lord over one another. But it ought not to be so among his disciples. Yet, I've seen it myself, situations where you have, white Christians who have adopted ideas of white supremacy from the broader society and try to Christianize it and culturally dominate spaces where all Christians of all races ought to be embraced and valued. You got white folks that won't serve under a black pastor. You got black professing Christians who consider you to be an Uncle Tom for taking the gospel to its logical conclusions, including what the gospel implies about forgiveness and reconciliation. All of these things are anti-gospel and demonic, I would say, right? But let's speed it up here because it's getting late and I do have a job to go to in the morning. Let me say this. Both unity and diversity are God's idea. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 17, verse 26 through 28. It says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God and perhaps might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. That was verse, 26 and 27. Think about it. It says, from one man, God made all nations. Now, some translations say one blood. When I looked up, it's the word one. There is the word henos, which just means one. So, but either way, the idea is the same. We see in Scripture, in Acts chapter 17, verse 26, we see Scripture pointing to the unity of humanity, as I mentioned a minute ago. But dig this. It also says that God appointed the time periods and boundaries, in other words, the geographical areas we would be born into. He appointed those things. God did it. Now, what's the implication here? Well, we know that God has made us communal beings. I mean, that's how marriages, families, communities, cultures, and nations are formed, right? All based on our nature, our tendency toward community. So God puts people in different times and locations with these communal tendencies, and in doing so is sovereignly, maybe we can say indirectly responsible for the diversity of people groups we see across the globe. Interesting. So, unfortunately, mankind has tended to forsake the unity of humanity and instead separated themselves on other grounds. Now, as a side note, some might want to bring up, the Tower of Babel as a counterpoint to God intending for diversity to occur, since it came seemingly about by consequence. But I think it's important to remember that through God's foreknowledge, he can sovereignly bring about his intentions, even through using human actions or even mistakes to do so. We can look at Judas, for example. Judas had a choice in betraying Christ, but nevertheless, knowing what Judas would do in any particular situation, God could orchestrate things in such a way that Judas, his free will to sin against God was, actualized within the context that would fulfill God's ultimate purposes. Likewise, with Joseph back in Genesis, commenting on being sold into slavery. He notes that what was meant for his demise, God used it for good, right? Turning lemons into preordained lemonade, I suppose. It's kind of God's specialty. So back to Acts, 17. In that one verse, from one man, God made all nations. That's unity. And he appointed the times and boundaries of when and where we would be, which gives rise to diversity. So in that one verse, God affirms both unity and diversity. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that there is a union of the two rather than a negation of either, right? A sort of symmetry or union between the unity and diversity. I mean, we've got one race of human beings that aren't separate races, as we've been told, but a spectrum of one race with a diversity of features among them. I mean, it just kind of reflects the artistic nature of God, I think. Race is like a divine expression of aesthetics, from God's view. God's all about diversity. All right. I mean, look at Israel. You had one nation, but you had 12 distinct tribes. God didn't just kind of lump them all together. You still had 12 distinct tribes, and they had kind of different roles and I'm sure different cultures within them, but yet they were one people. Right. The Apostle Paul apparently thought, highly of being from the tribe of Benjamin, but of course, he counted it as dung compared to, what we have in Christ. But, apparently that was a big deal to him. It was something, a part of his identity. Right. So, again, God affirms the union of unity and diversity. But somewhere along the line, that old devil boy just convinced us that the two of those just don't complement one another, that they can't coexist. Racism is an attempt to take our differences and exalt them above that God-ordained unity. Now, the flip side of that is in church, we have folks who say they don't see color or all differences just don't matter. But in doing so, I think that they exalt unity over and against that God-ordained diversity, right? Again, God affirms both. Now, interestingly, in John chapter 17, we see Jesus praying for those of us who would become his disciples, that we be one, even as he and the Father are one. That's interesting, isn't it? In the context of what we're talking about here, I can't help but think of the Trinity, right? I mean, you got three distinct persons that eternally existing in one being or essence, right? I mean, certainly the Trinity, you got the ultimate expression of the union of unity with diversity. It would seem that there's something about, oneness and diversity of mankind that just reflects that, just an aspect of the nature of God. Now, the ultimate reflection of that union of unity and diversity, I think on the human level would be, marriage. So we got to come full circle here. When man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. Paul says that union of marriage isn't just about two people who like each other and coming together, have kids and a dog and a white picket fence and all that good stuff. Marriage is higher than that, right? Marriage and the love that flows between spouses is a reflection of union between Christ and the church. Marriage is a divine institution, not just a cog in the grand scheme of some socio-political movement, as some apparently would have us to believe, Umar Johnson. But because, marriage between believers is a holy thing, we ought to treat it as such. We shouldn't stain it with the ills of society. We really shouldn't. Marriage was created by God and should align with what he values and intended for it. Now, if we do stain it, with the conditions and just the minutia of mankind screwing everything up, then we just dilute the power of it. And what do I mean by that? Well, if the prejudices and conditions of our society are guiding who we marry, then we have done the gospel a disservice. Jesus said that they will know you are my disciples by the way you love one another. A transcendent sort of love is a calling card of the gospel, right? So citizens of God's kingdom are shown to be distinct from the world by how they love one another. So to suggest that when it comes to marriage between two Christians, that we ought to bow our knee to racial baggage of the broader society, it just violates the very nature of what God intended marriage to be. Marriage between two believers is a holy thing that shouldn't be shackled by something that ultimately derives from a basis of identity that doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Remember, as I said earlier, race is a belief. A belief. Now, as Christians, what are we commanded to do with our beliefs? We are to align them to the truth, right? We are to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, not color, culture, or conditions, to the obedience of Christ, right? We are to continue in his word, and in being his disciples, we will know the truth, and the truth will set us free. We are not to be conformed to this world with all its racialized division and hatred. We are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds and be living sacrifices. That means dying to self, y'all. It means dying to self. Some of us need to die to who we believe we are in order for us to be who God called us to be. Mankind was created in God's image for the purpose of communing with God and reflecting his glory in the earth. That glory is in part reflected through the union of unity and diversity that God has embedded in creation and the human experience. I would argue that marriage between a man and a woman was intended to be the human pinnacle of that symmetry or union of unity and diversity. And to inhibit, despise, or oppose a marriage that God approves of because of our own prejudices or the predicament we find our people group in is to put ourselves at odds with God's agenda of expressing his glory in the earth. Now, that coupled with the fact that interracial marriage strikes at the belief of race, which is at the core of whatever race-related conditions we face, it seems to me that a Christian has no good reason to agree with Dr. Umar as it relates to interracial marriage or hold negative sentiments about interracial marriage in general. Now, with that said, I mean, I'm not saying you have to go out and marry somebody outside your race right now, so-called race. I mean, we all have preferences. There's nothing wrong with preferences. I'm not trying to be, legalistic here. But even with our preferences, we have to disciple those. Like, we have to bring those under subjection. And if we find that our preferences are rooted in something that is contrary to God's nature and will for our lives, then it's our responsibility to conform even those preferences to something that honors God. Something to think about. So let me finish up here with this. Between these three interviews, over and over again, this issue of Frederick Douglass, in his old age getting married to a white woman, Helen Pitts Douglas, just kept coming up, right? So that just kind of intrigued me. I really wondered if I could find any historical information about their marriage and, kind of how they saw it. Given Dr. Umar's negative view of interracial marriage in general, which we spent time dismantling, I wanted to get a better perspective, on their relationship that wasn't blackwashed by Dr. Johnson. We always talk about history and religion being whitewashed. Well, I think that, in some cases, folks like Dr. Umar Johnson, they attempt to blackwash history. They have a tendency to do that. By that, I mean, they kind of overlay actual history with their current views about race as they interpret what has gone on in the past. Now, what I discovered is that it's a very different story than Dr. Umar presents. I mean, Dr. Umar mentions that, the movie about the couple, the Lovings, that came out recently. I went to school in Caroline County where all that went down. So, actually went to school with a grandson of the Lovings. As a matter of fact, shout out to them. But it turns out that Frederick Douglass and his second wife, Helen, were basically the Lovings family before the Lovings family. When Douglass and his second wife, basically eloped, it was a national scandal. Newspaper after newspaper had lots to say about it. And apparently, everywhere they went, the media was in their face, giving them the third degree about it. Even some folks who had worked alongside them, from the abolitionist community, both black and white, were apparently very vocal, condemning that relationship. It's interesting stuff, man. You did have some activists like Ida B. Wells and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who publicly stood by the couple, but it was no small thing, man. It was a big deal. I mean, to the degree, actually, Douglass and his wife did go to Europe for a period of time to kind of, get away from it all, Interesting quote. Ida B. Wells reportedly said, about the relationship with Frederick Douglass and Helen Pitts Douglas, the white lady that he married late in life. She says, Ida B. Wells says, "The more I saw of them, the more I admired them both for the patient and uncomplaining way they met the sneers and discourtesies heaped upon them, especially Mrs. Douglas. The friendship and hospitality I enjoyed at the hands of these two great souls is among my treasured memories." But what about the couple themselves? What did they have to say to their critics? I found a couple statements made by Frederick Douglass on it in a letter written to Amy Post. Very interesting. You see his kind of fiery side coming out. I got to read this. He says, "I have had very little sympathy with the curiosity of the world about my domestic relations. What business has the world with the color of my wife?" Wow. Yeah, actually, after describing the media frenzy about his marriage, Douglass goes on to say, "I do not much to satisfy the public on these points. But there is one upon which I wish you, as an old and dear friend, to be entirely satisfied, and that is that Helen and I are making life go very happily, and that neither of us has yet repented of our marriage." In other words, Douglass didn't give a crap about what the Umars of the world of his day had to say about his marriage because he and his wife were happy. Very interesting, On that note, I give you this quote. Finishing up here, I give you this quote, which I think is even more interesting than the first. During an interview in, I believe, 1891, I think Frederick Douglass was around 73 or so. He didn't know his birthday, so he couldn't track his actual age, throughout his life. It's very interesting. But in 1891, he was being interviewed by the New York World, in Rochester, New York. And the interviewer asked Douglass how he was doing, as Douglass was playing croquet with his wife, Helen. And Douglass responds, "What can the world give me more than I already possess? I am blessed with a loving wife who is in every sense of the word a helpmate, who enters into all my joys and sorrows. Now, Dr. Umar claims that a white woman could never feel the black man's struggle, right? How many people struggle as much as Frederick Douglass? I mean, as a black man, and even more so, as a black man who fought his whole life for the liberty of Africans. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who endured more and put in more work than this man. And he staunchly disagrees with Dr. Umar. He says that his white wife, Helen Pitts Douglas, was in every sense a helpmate and entered into all his joys and sorrows. I mean, that's just powerful right there. Powerful right there. On the other side of the equation, Helen Pitts Douglas captures something very interesting when she says, "Love came to me and I was not afraid to marry the man that I loved because of his color." Very interesting. She didn't allow fear to keep her from love, even in the face of, very real danger. I mean, in post-Civil War America, I mean, that's a special kind of courage right there. But Dr. Umar isn't concerned with that kind of bravery. He would prefer that we lay love aside or subjugate it to man-made conditions that have in one form or another, been around for just about all human history. I disagree with Dr. Umar and his analysis of some sort of pathology that he attributes to Frederick Douglass to give his ancestors somewhat of a pass. I side with Frederick Douglass. I don't think that his marriage to Helen Pitts Douglas is something that needs to be explained away, just so we can feel better about it, right? Now, given Dr. Umar's area of expertise in psychology, I understand why he would lean towards, that type of explanation, that he lays on Frederick Douglass finding love and marrying, a white woman, which he believes to be problematic. But I don't think that Dr. Umar has taken all the evidence into account. I mean, it seems to me that Douglass, his second marriage, was an outworking of his ethics and convictions about equality, as well as, good old practicality. Here's what I mean by that. In an essay Douglass wrote entitled "The Future of the Negro Race," Frederick Douglass argues that the merging of races in America is inevitable. He says that interracial marriage is not something that, to be esteemed necessarily or despised, at least not by him. It will just happen. So, let me end here with a quick quote from Douglass from that essay, which I think is interesting. Quote, "Races and varieties of the human family appear and disappear, but humanity remains and will remain forever. The American people will one day be truer to this idea than now." Frederick Douglass. I agree with him. I don't think America is all the way there yet, but I think we're on the way. And as a human being and as a Christian, I don't have a problem with that. Well, that's another episode in the books. Catch y'all next time. Peace.